In the quaint village of Elmwood, a jar of homemade plum jam wins the fete prize suite, irresistible and deadly. But when Colonel Baxter takes one bite and collapses in agony, poisoned by arsenic hidden in its depths, the horror begins. Miss Jane Marple arrives, knitting clues together as whispers of affairs, blackmail, and land feuds swirl. Then, the jam strikes again, killing the herbalist Lydia Finch in her locked room. Was it revenge? A family secret exploding? Or a doctor's desperate cover-up? Twists unravel, jars swapped in shadows, forged letters from the dead, and a vicar's fatal act of love turning protection into murder. But the ultimate shock: who laced the jam first, and why did fate twist it to claim an innocent soul? Dive into this Agatha Christie-inspired mystery where sweetness hides poison and one taste changes everything. Stay hooked, the truth is stickier than you think. Chapter 1. The Village Phaeton, the serene embrace of Elmwood. A village cradled by the gentle undulations of the English countryside, the air thrummed with the hum of anticipation. It was the day of the annual fete, a tradition as old as the gnarled oaks that dotted the village green. The summer sun cast a golden glow over the scene, illuminating stalls festooned with bunting and laden with the fruits of local labor, freshly baked scones, golden-crusted pies, and jars of preserves that gleamed like jewels. Among the crowd, Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming spinster from St. Mary Mead, sat beneath one such oak, her knitting needles clicking in a rhythm as steady as the village clock. She had come to Elmwood to visit her niece, Margaret, who had recently settled here with her husband, a solicitor with a penchant for rural charm. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, hidden behind the mild demeanor of an elderly lady, took in every detail of the bustling fete. The green was a kaleidoscope of activity. Children darted between stalls, clutching toffee apples, their laughter mingling with the strains of a local band playing a jaunty tune. Farmers and housewives haggled good-naturedly over jars of chutney and knitted scarves, while the vicar, the Reverend Mr. Hargrove, moved among his flock, his round face beaming with pride at the event's success. His wife, Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, presided over the preserve stall, her starched apron as crisp as her manner. Her plum jam, a recipe handed down through generations, was the talk of the village, its deep purple hue and rich aroma drawing a steady stream of admirers. Quite the best this year, Miss Marple, Mrs. Hargrove declared, offering a sample on a sliver of bread. My grandmother's secret, wild plums from the old orchard. Miss Marple accepted the morsel with a polite smile, her taste buds noting the tart sweetness. Delicious, Mrs. Hargrove, she said, her voice soft but her mind already cataloguing the scene. She observed the way Mrs. Hargrove's eyes flickered with pride, the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged her jars, and the way the crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. There was something in the air, Miss Marple thought, a faint undercurrent of tension beneath the joviality, like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody nearby. Colonel Reginald Baxter, a retired military man with a bristling moustache and a penchant for loud opinions, was holding court at the tea tent. His booming voice carried over the chatter, recounting tales of his days in India to a small audience that included Dr. Lionel Thorpe, the village's young physician, and Lydia Finch, the Hargroves' lodger, a woman of indeterminate age whose sharp features and herbalist's knowledge made her both respected and mistrusted. The colonel, red-faced from the heat and perhaps a touch of sherry, gestured expansively. Mark my words, Thorpe, This village could use a bit of discipline. Too much gossip, not enough action. Dr. Thorpe, a lean man with a scholarly air, nodded politely but said little, his fingers drumming on the tablecloth. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the trio. Colonel Baxter's bluster was familiar. She had known men like him in St. Mary Mead, men whose confidence masked deeper insecurities. Dr. Thorpe, on the other hand, had the quiet intensity of a man who listened more than he spoke, his eyes darting to the preserve stall where Mrs. Hargrove was now engaged in a heated discussion with a customer over the price of a jar. Lydia Finch, meanwhile, stood apart, her hands clasped tightly, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she considered the dynamics at play. Villages, she knew, were like tapestries, every thread connected, every knot hiding a story. As the afternoon wore on, the fete reached its zenith. The vicar announced the winners of the baking and preserve competitions, with Mrs. Hargrove's plum jam taking first prize, as expected. A cheer went up, though Miss Marple noted a few tight smiles among the other competitors. Envy, she thought, was as common as dandelions in a place like Elmwood. She sipped her tea, served in a delicate china cup, and listened to the snippets of conversation around her. The postmistress, Miss Clara Beale, was whispering to a neighbour about Colonel Baxter's recent dispute with Dr. Thorpe over a strip of land near the river. Heard they nearly came to blows at the parish meeting, Miss Beale said, her voice low but eager. And then there's that business with the Colonel's trips to Netherby. Miss Marple filed this away, her mind as sharp as the pins. In her knitting bag, she had long ago learned that village gossip, while often exaggerated, held grains of truth that could prove invaluable. Her niece, Margaret, joined her under the oak, her face flushed from helping at the flower stall. "Aunt Jane, isn't it lovely? Everyone's so happy today," she exclaimed, oblivious to the undercurrents her aunt had already sensed. "Quite lovely, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her eyes crinkling with affection. "But happiness, like jam, can sometimes be spread too thin." Margaret laughed, assuming her aunt was being whimsical, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. She watched as Colonel Baxter approached the preserve store, his gait purposeful. He purchased a jar of Mrs. Hargrove's jam, exchanging pleasantries that seemed to Miss Marple's keen ear a touch forced. Mrs. Hargrove's smile was gracious, but her fingers tightened on the jar as she handed it over. The fete wound down as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the green. Villagers began to disperse, carrying their purchases and their stories home. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked away, walked with Margaret back to the neat little cottage on the edge of the village. The air was cooler now, scented with honeysuckle and the promise of evening, yet Miss Marple's mind was not at ease. There was something about the the glances, the whispers, the way certain hands lingered near certain jars that suggested Elmwood's peace was as fragile as the china cups at the tea tent. That evening, the vicarage hosted a small gathering to celebrate the fete's success. Miss Marple, invited as Margaret's guest, sat in a corner of the drawing room, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. The room was warm with candlelight and the clink of teacups, the atmosphere genial but tinged with the fatigue of a long day. Present were the Hargroves, Colonel Baxter, Dr. Thorpe, Lydia Finch, and a few other notables, including Mr. Percival Wren, the village solicitor and Margaret's husband. Mrs. Hargrove, ever the hostess, circulated with a tray of toast spread. With her prize-winning jam, her pride evident in every gesture. Colonel Baxter, seated near the fireplace, accepted a piece with enthusiasm. "Nothing like a good jam to end the day, Eleanor," he said, his voice hearty. He took a large bite, savouring it with a nod. Miss Marple watched her needles idle in her lap. She noted the Colonel's flushed cheeks, the way Dr. eyes followed the toast, and the slight frown on Lydia Finch's face as she declined a piece, citing a delicate stomach. The conversation turned to village matters, repairs to the church roof, the upcoming harvest festival, but Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the Colonel. Suddenly, the room stilled. Colonel Baxter's hand flew to his throat, his face contorting in a grimace of pain. His teacup clattered to the floor, shattering into fragments. "My God," he gasped, his voice a strangled croak. He lurched forward, his chair scraping against the polished wood, and collapsed in a heap, his eyes wide with shock. Dr. Thorpe was at his side in an instant, loosening the Colonel's collar, but it was no use. Within moments, the man who had commanded battalions lay dead, his final breath a shuddering sigh. A stunned silence enveloped the room. Mrs. Hargrove dropped her tray, the toast scattering like fallen leaves. The vicar, pale as his clerical collar, stammered a prayer. Lydia Finch stood frozen, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles gleamed white. Dr. Thorpe, his face grim, checked for a pulse, then shook his head. "He's gone," he said quietly, his voice steady but his eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Miss Marple, unnoticed in her corner, observed it all. Her mind, honed by years of unraveling human nature, began to weave the threads of the evening into a pattern. "How very peculiar," she murmured, her voice so soft it was lost in the growing murmur of shock. The vicar's wife was sobbing now, clinging to her husband, while Dr. Thorpe issued calm instructions to fetch the police. Lydia Finch slipped quietly to the edge of the room, her eyes darting to the broken teacup. Margaret, trembling, approached. Her aunt, Aunt Jane, "What's happened? Was it the jam?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her eyes wide with horror. Miss Marple patted her niece's hand, her expression serene but her mind racing. "We shall see, my dear," she said. "But I suspect this jam has a story to tell, and not a sweet one." As the guests dispersed, their faces etched with disbelief, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on the jar of plum jam on the sideboard. It stood innocently among the teacups, its label pristine, its contents untouched since the Colonel's fatal bite. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of the little scandals and secrets that had unravelled there, and of how often the simplest things, a cup of tea, a piece of toast, could hide the darkest truths. Elmwood, she knew, was no different. The village, fate, with its laughter and light, had cast a shadow that would not soon fade. The police arrived shortly after, led by Inspector Harlan, a brisk man with a nonsense air and a moustache that rivaled the Colonel's. He took charge, questioning each guest briefly and securing the vicarage kitchen. The jar of jam was taken for analysis, and the body was removed under a sheet, its departure watched by a huddle of villagers who had gathered outside. Miss Marple, declining to be questioned that night, promised to return in the morning. As she walked back to Margaret's cottage, the night air cool against her cheek, she replayed the evening's events. The Colonel's collapse, the jam's prominence, the fleeting expressions of those around Harl were pieces of a puzzle she was determined to solve in her niece's spare room. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting untouched. The moon cast a silver glow over Elmwood, illuminating the rooftops and the distant orchard where Mrs. Hargrove's wild plums grew. She thought of the preserve store, the Colonel's bluster, the doctor's reserve, and Lydia Finch's reticence. And she thought of the jam, that innocent concoction that had turned deadly in a single bite. Human nature, she mused, her voice a whisper in the dark, is like a village fete, all smiles and sweetness until you taste the poison beneath. The next morning would bring questions, suspicions, and perhaps revelations. But for now, Miss Marple closed her eyes, her mind already sifting through the day's impressions, seeking the thread that would unravel the mystery of the plum jam that killed. In Elmwood, as in St. Mary Mead, nothing was ever quite as it seemed. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Guest. The morning after the tragedy at the vicarage dawned with a deceptive calm, the kind that cloaks a village in the wake of sudden death. Elmwood's cobbled lanes were quiet, save for the soft cooing of doves and the occasional creak of a cartwheel. Miss Jane Marple, seated at her niece Margaret's breakfast table, sipped tea from a chipped porcelain cup, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet alertness of a cat. Margaret, still shaken from the previous night's events, bustled about the kitchen, her hands trembling as she sliced bread. "Aunt Jane," she said, her voice low, "do you think it was really the jam? Poor Colonel Baxter, and Mrs. Hargrove, she's beside herself." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock. "It appears so, my dear," she replied, her tone gentle but her mind elsewhere. "But appearances, you know, can be as misleading as a sunny day before a storm." She had not slept much, her thoughts circling the scene in the vicarage drawing room, Colonel Baxter's collapse, the jar of plum jam, the fleeting glances among the guests. There was a pattern, she felt, waiting to be discerned, like the faint outline of a stitch in her knitting. The vicarage, a sturdy Georgian house with ivy-clad walls, was now a hub of activity. Inspector Harlan had arrived at first light, his brisk efficiency cutting through the village's shock. He was a man of middle years, with a penchant for order and a distrust of the seemingly trivial details that Miss Marple found so illuminating. His men had cordoned off the kitchen, and a young constable stood guard at the front door, his face pale but resolute. Miss Marple, accompanied by Margaret, made her way to the vicarage, her black handbag swinging lightly at her side. She wore her usual attire, a tweed skirt, a sensible blouse, and a hat adorned with a single feather butt. Her demeanor carried an authority that belied her unassuming appearance. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and grief. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove sat in the drawing room, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands twisting a lace handkerchief. The vicar, Reverend Mr. Hargrove, hovered nearby, his clerical collar slightly askew, murmuring words of comfort that seemed to fall on deaf ears. Dr. Lionel Thorpe was present too, his scholarly features drawn, his hands clasped behind his back as he answered the inspector's questions. Lydia Finch, the Hargroves' lodger, stood by the window, her sharp profile silhouetted against the morning light, her silence as pronounced as the other's distress. Inspector Harlan, notebook in hand, was methodical. "Mrs. Hargrove," he began, his voice clipped, "you prepared the jam yourself, correct? No one else had access to it before the fete?" Mrs. Hargrove nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Inspector. I made it in the kitchen, as I always do. The jars were sealed, stored in the pantry. I can't understand how—" Her words dissolved into a sob, and the vicar placed a hand on her shoulder. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively on a chintz-covered chair, listened intently. She noted the tremor in Mrs. Hargrove's voice, the way her eyes darted to the pantry door, and the slight stiffening of Dr. Thorpe's posture at the mention of the jam. Lydia Finch, she observed, remained statue-like, her fingers tracing the edge of a curtain. The inspector pressed on, questioning Dr. Thorpe about the Colonel's health. He was fit for his age, the doctor said, his tone measured. Rheumatism troubled him, but nothing to suggest. His hesitation was brief, but Miss Marple caught it, her mind filing it away like a stitch in a complex pattern. The autopsy report, delivered by a courier from the county lab, confirmed the cause of death: arsenic poisoning, with traces found in the remnants of the toast Colonel Baxter had eaten. The jar from the vicarage, however, tested clean, a fact that deepened the inspector's frown. Then how the devil did the poison get into the jam? He muttered, pacing the room. Miss Marple's eyes followed him, but her thoughts were on the fete, on the crowded stall. The hands that had reached for jars, the smiles that might have hidden malice. As the morning progressed, the vicarage became a stage for quiet revelations. Miss Clara Beale, the postmistress, arrived to offer condolences and, under the inspector's probing, mentioned a recent altercation between Colonel Baxter and Dr. Thorpe. It was about that land by the river, she said, her voice eager with the relish of gossip. The Colonel wanted to sell it for development, but Dr. Thorpe was dead set against it. Said it would ruin the village's charm. Dr. Thorpe's jaw tightened, but he offered no defense, merely stating he had been at the surgery during the fate's setup. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, considered this. Land disputes, she knew, could fester like untreated wounds, especially in a village where every acre was cherished. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a quarrel over a garden plot had led to bitter words and, eventually, a broken window, but murder. That required a deeper motive, a colder heart. Her gaze drifted to Lydia Finch, who had yet to speak. The woman's herbalist knowledge was well known. Villagers sought her remedies for everything from colds to sleeplessness. Could her garden, Miss Marple wondered, contain more than chamomile and lavender? The inspector turned his attention to Lydia. Miss Finch, you're familiar with plants. Aren't you anything in your collection that might accidentally find its way into a jam? His tone was sharp, almost accusing. Lydia's eyes met his, unflinching. My herbs are for healing, Inspector, she said, her voice low and steady. I've no use for poisons. Yet Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the curtain, the slight quiver in her lip. There was something there, she thought. Something unspoken as the questioning continued. Miss Marple excused herself to examine the pantry, with the inspector's reluctant permission. The small room was tidy, its shelves lined with jars of preserves, pickles, and chutneys, all labelled in Mrs. Hargrove's neat hand. The plum jam jars stood out, their deep purple contents catching the light. Miss Marple peered closely, her fingers brushing the labels. One jar, marked Fate Special, seemed slightly different, its lid a fraction looser, its label faintly smudged. She made no comment but stored the observation away, like a skein of wool waiting to be unravelled. Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere grew tenser. Mrs. Hargrove, recovering her composure, insisted on serving tea, as if normalcy could banish the spectre of death. Miss Marple accepted a cup, her eyes never leaving the group. She noticed Dr. Thorpe's reluctance to drink, his hand hovering over the saucer as if expecting another calamity. The vicar, meanwhile, seemed distracted, his gaze flitting to the window where Lydia stood. And Lydia herself, Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance she exchanged with the vicar, a look that spoke of secrets shared in quieter moments. As the morning wore on, villagers began to gather outside, their whispers carrying through the open windows. The news of Colonel Baxter's death had spread like wildfire, each tongue adding its own embellishment. Miss Marple, stepping outside for a breath of air, overheard snippets: the Colonel's temper, his rumoured liaisons in Netherby, his recent decision to revise his will. She paused by the garden gate, where roses bloomed in profusion, and considered the human heart. So often, she murmured to herself, it is the smallest things, a word, a glance, a jar of jam, that reveal the deepest truths. Margaret joined her, her face pale. Aunt Jane, it's dreadful. Everyone's talking, saying it must be someone close to the vicarage, do you think? Could it be one of them? Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her arm. My dear, she said, in a village, everyone is close to everyone else. But closeness breeds both love and hate, and sometimes it's hard to tell one from the other. She glanced back at the vicarage, where Inspector Harlan was now conferring with his constable. The puzzle was incomplete, but Miss Marple felt the first threads coming together. The jam, the Colonel, the hidden tendency would watch and listen and wait. For in Elmwood, as in St. Mary Mead, the truth had a way of rising to the surface, like bubbles in a pot of simmering preserves. Chapter 3. The initial inquiry. The dawn of the following day brought with it a veil of mist that clung to the rooftops of Elmwood like a shroud, muting the colours of the village and amplifying the sense of unease that had settled over its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood by the window of her niece's cottage, gazing out at the Duchist gardens and the distant spire of the church. Her mind, sharp and unyielding despite the hour, revisited the events of the previous evening at the vicarage. Colonel Baxter's sudden demise, the jar of plum jam that had seemed so innocuous, the expressions on the faces of those present, all these elements danced in her thoughts, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered across a table. She knew from long experience that the key to assembling them lay not in haste but in patient observation. Margaret, her niece, emerged from the kitchen with a tray bearing tea and toast, her face still etched with the shock of the night before. Aunt Jane, she said, setting the tray down with a slight clatter, I hardly slept a wink. To think that poor Colonel Baxter, and right there in the drawing-room. Do you suppose it was an accident? Some dreadful mistake with the jam? Her voice trembled, revealing the fragility beneath her usual composure. Miss Marple turned from the window, her eyes kind but probing. Accidents, my dear, are rarely as simple as they appear, she replied, settling into her chair and accepting a cup of tea, especially when they involve something as everyday as a pot of jam. No, I fear there is more to this than meets the eye. She sipped her tea thoughtfully, her mind already mapping out the day's inquiries. Villages like Elmwood, she reflected, were breeding grounds for secrets, where the veneer of civility often concealed currents of resentment and envy as deep as the nearby river. By mid-morning, the mist had lifted, replaced by a pale sun that did little to dispel the chill in the air. Inspector Harlan arrived at the vicarage with the punctuality of a man accustomed to routine, his motor car crunching to a halt on the gravel drive. He was a figure of authority, tall and lean, with a moustache trimmed to precision and eyes that missed nothing, or so he believed, accompanied by a sergeant and a constable. He entered the vicarage with a nod to the vicar, who greeted him at the door with a mixture of relief and apprehension. Inspector, Reverend Hargrove said, his voice steady but his hands clasped tightly. We are all in a state of profound shock. My wife, she hasn't stopped weeping." The inspector inclined his head, his expression sympathetic yet detached. "Understandable, sir. A tragic business. But we must get to the bottom of it. The autopsy results have come through arsenic poisoning, without a doubt, and the traces were found in the jam residue on the toast the Colonel consumed." He glanced around the hallway, noting the polished floors and the faint scent of lavender polish. As if assessing the household's character, Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, seated in the drawing room with a shawl draped over her shoulders, looked up as they entered. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from tears, but there was a resilience in her posture that spoke of inner strength. "Inspector," she whispered, "I can't believe it. My jam, ... I've made it the same way for years, stored in the pantry, sealed tight. No one could have tampered with it." Her voice broke, and she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Inspector Harlan took a seat opposite her, his notebook open on his knee. "We'll need to examine that pantry, ma'am, and question everyone who had access to the kitchen. Tell me, who else lives here?" His pen hovered, ready to record. "The vicar and I," Mrs. Hargrove replied, "and our lodger, Miss Lydia Finch. She's been with us for over a year now. A quiet woman, knowledgeable about herbs and such." At the mention of Lydia, a shadow crossed her face, fleeting but noticeable. To Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly and taken her place in a corner armchair, her knitting in hand, the inspector nodded, making a note. "Herbs, you say? Interesting. We'll speak to her shortly." He turned to the vicar. "And visitors? Anyone unusual in the days leading up to the fete?" Reverend Hargrove shook his head. "No one out of the ordinary. The usual parishioners, committee members for the fete. Dr. Thorpe dropped by to discuss the land matter with Colonel Baxter. They had a bit of a disagreement, but nothing serious." Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily. The land dispute again, she thought. It had surfaced in whispers at the fete and now here in the vicarage. She recalled similar squabbles in St. Mary Mead, where property lines could ignite passions as fierce as any romance. Sipping her tea, which Mrs. Hargrove had insisted on serving, despite the circumstances, she murmured softly to Margaret, who sat beside her, "People are like jam, my dear, sweet on the surface, but sometimes hiding a bitter core." Margaret nodded, though her aunt's words puzzled her. Miss Marple's analogies, drawn from everyday life, often concealed deeper insights into human nature. She watched as Inspector Harlan continued his questioning, his manner efficient but lacking the subtlety that Miss Marple deemed essential. Lydia Finch was summoned next. She entered the room with a measured step, her attire simple and severe. Grey dress buttoned to the neck, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was composed, but her eyes held a wariness that did not escape the inspector's notice. "Miss Finch," he began, "you handle herbs, I understand. Any that might contain arsenic or similar substances." Lydia's gaze met his steadily. "My collection is for remedies, Inspector. Foxglove for the heart, valerian for sleep. Nothing poisonous, though some plants can be harmful if misused." Her voice was calm, but Miss Marple noted the slight clenching of her fists in her lap. "And your access to the kitchen?" the inspector pressed. "Do you prepare your own meals?" "I do, occasionally," Lydia admitted. "But the pantry is Mrs. Hargrove's domain. I rarely go there." She glanced at Mrs. Hargrove, who nodded confirmation, though her expression was guarded. Inspector Harlan made another note, his suspicion evident. Arsenic, he knew, could be derived from certain plants, or even rat poisons common in rural households. He dispatched his sergeant to search Lydia's room, a decision that elicited a protest from the vicar. "Surely that's unnecessary," Reverend Hargrove said. "Miss Finch is a respected member of our community." "Procedure, sir," the inspector replied curtly. "We must leave no stone unturned." As the sergeant departed, Dr. Lionel Thorpe arrived, summoned by a constable. He entered with a professional air, his medical bag in hand, though no patient required his services. "Inspector," he said, taking a seat, "I've reviewed the autopsy preliminaries. Arsenic, yes, but the dose was substantial, not something accidental. I'd wager." The inspector leaned forward. "You prescribed for the colonel, didn't you? Rheumatism treatments, anything containing arsenic?" Dr. Thorpe nodded. "Arsenic was used in small doses for such ailments, but I hadn't prescribed it recently. His bottle would have been in his own home." His tone was matter-of-fact, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of defensiveness. "And this land dispute with the colonel?" Inspector Harlan asked, his eyes sharp. "Heard it got heated. A difference of opinion," Dr. Thorpe said dismissively. "He wanted to develop the riverside plot. I thought it better preserved for the village, but we parted amicably." He shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on his bag. Miss Marple, her knitting progressing steadily, considered this. Amicably, perhaps, but grudges lingered like stains on linen. She recalled the colonel's bluster at the fete, the doctor's reserved demeanor. There was tension there, she felt, waiting to be probed. The inquiry continued through the morning, with villagers called in one by one. Miss Clara Beale, the postmistress, arrived breathless, her hat askew. "Dreadful business," she clucked, settling into a chair. "Colonel Baxter was in fine form yesterday, posting letters to Netherby. Always so secretive about those." Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of sharing gossip. "Netherby," the inspector echoed. "What business there?" Miss Beale leaned forward conspiratorially. "Rumors of a lady friend, Inspector, though he'd deny it. And then there's his will, he mentioned revising it just last week at Mr. Wren's office. Mr. Percival Wren, Margaret's husband and the village solicitor, was next. He confirmed the will revision. The colonel disinherited his nephew, favoring a charity the vicar supports. But it's all above board, he assured, though his glance at the vicar was brief as the interviews unfolded. Miss Marple observed from her corner, her presence almost forgotten amid the bustle. She noted the vicar's fidgeting, Mrs. Hargrove's occasional glances at Lydia, Dr. Thorpe's composed facade. The pantry was examined, jars tested, but no arsenic found. Yet the toast had been poisoned how? Lunch was a somber affair, sandwiches served in the dining room. Miss Marple declined, preferring to stroll in the garden, where roses bloomed defiantly. Against the gloom, she paused by the herb bed, Lydia's domain, fingering a leaf of foxglove. Dangerous beauty, she thought. Like so many things in life, returning inside, she found Inspector Harlan poring over notes. "A puzzle, miss," he said, acknowledging her for the first time. "Poison in the jam, but the jar clean. Suggests tampering at the table, perhaps. Or before," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "People move about at gatherings. A moment's distraction, ... The inspector grunted, unconvinced, but Miss Marple's mind was worry. The argument over land, the will, the herbs, the secret sore threads in a tapestry of motive and opportunity. As afternoon waned, more details emerged. A villager recalled seeing Dr. Thorpe near the vicarage pantry window the day before the fete. Just passing by, the doctor insisted when confronted. Lydia's room yielded nothing incriminating, but a book on poisons was found, dog-eared, at the arsenic page. Research for remedies, she explained coolly. Mrs. Hargrove, overwrought, retired to her room, the vicar attending her. Miss Marple, walking back to the cottage with Margaret, reflected. On the day's revelations, bitter cause, she murmured again. The inquiry was initial, but the seeds of suspicion were sown, ready to sprout in the fertile soil of Elmwood's secrets. The evening brought no resolution, only more questions. Inspector Harlan departed, promising further tests. Miss Marple, by the fireside, knitted on, her thoughts unraveling the knot of the plum jam mystery. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such tangles before. Here, she would see this one through. Chapter 4. Whispers in the garden. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves of the vicarage garden, casting dappled shadows on the gravel paths that wound between beds of lavender and roses. Elmwood, though still shrouded in the aftermath of Colonel Baxter's untimely death, carried on with the quiet resilience of rural life. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, strolled along these paths, ostensibly to admire the blooms, but in truth to gather the whispers that fluttered like butterflies among the villagers. She had always found gardens to be confessional spaces, where tongues loosened amid the scent of earth and flowers, revealing truths that drawing rooms concealed. Mrs. Hargrove's herb garden, neatly bordered with boxwood, drew Miss Marple's attention first. Lydia Finch tended it with a devotion that bordered on possessiveness, her gloved hands plucking weeds with precise movements. Miss Marple paused, her eyes taking in the array of plants, mint, rosemary, and the more exotic foxglove and monkshood, whose toxic properties were well known to anyone with a modicum of botanical knowledge. A lovely garden, Miss Finch, Miss Marple said mildly, her voice carrying over the hum of bees. You must find great solace in it. Lydia looked up, her sharp features softening slightly. It is my sanctuary, Miss Marple. Herbs have powers that go beyond the kitchen, though some would misuse them. Her tone held a note of defensiveness, as if anticipating accusation. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of innocent interest. Indeed, in St. Mary Mead, we had a lady much like you, skilled with remedies, but she once confused hemlock with parsley, with unfortunate results. Lydia's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, returning to her weeding with renewed vigor. As Miss Marple continued her walk, she encountered Miss Clara Beale, the postmistress, clipping stems for a bouquet. Miss Beale's face lit up with the eagerness of one who thrived on news. Miss Marple, such a dreadful affair. Poor Colonel Baxter delivered his mail just days ago. Letters from Netherby, you know, addressed in a woman's hand. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They say he had a paramour there, a widow with a taste for luxury. Perhaps his wife knew, but she's long gone. Still, jealousy can linger, can't it? Miss Marple's needles, produced from her bag, began their rhythmic clicking. Jealousy, Miss Beale, is like a weed, it spreads, if not uprooted. She encouraged the postmistress with a gentle probe. And these letters frequent, were they? Oh yes, Miss Beale replied, her scissors snipping emphatically, weakly at least, and replies sent back promptly. But lately he seemed agitated, arguing with Dr. Thorpe over that land. The doctor wants it for a clinic extension, but the colonel had other plans development, they say, with investors from Netherby. Her eyes gleamed. Money changes people, doesn't it? Miss Marple filed this away, her mind connecting dots like stitches in a pattern. The land dispute, now tied to external interests, added layers to the motive. She bid Miss Beale goodbye and wandered toward the orchard, where wild plums hung heavy on the branches. Here, the vicar was pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, his face etched with worry. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile, seeking respite from the chaos. "Chaos reveals character, vicar," she replied softly. "Your wife, how is she bearing up?" Reverend Hargrove sighed, glancing back at the vicarage. "Eleanor is distraught. That jam was her pride, and now, poisoned. But the lab says the jar is clean. How can that be?" Miss Marple gazed at the plums, their skins a deep violet. Perhaps the poison was not in the jar, but added later. A sleight of hand at the table. The vicar's eyes widened. But who? "We were all friends. Colonel Baxter, Dr. Thorpe, Lydia." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the hesitation. "On Lydia's name, friends can harbour secrets," she said. "Like that charity in the Colonel's William Parish benefits, I hear." The vicar nodded. "Yes, a generous bequest. But I had no hand in it. He was moved by our work with the poor." Yet his gaze shifted, and Miss Marple wondered if there was, more perhaps, a persuasion. Subtle but effective. Leaving the vicar to his thoughts, Miss Marple meandered to the garden's edge, where a bench overlooked the river. Dr. Lionel Thorpe sat there, staring at the water's flow, his medical bag at his feet. "Doctor," she greeted, settling beside him. A peaceful spot amid turmoil. He turned, his scholarly face lined with fatigue. "Peace is elusive, Miss Marple. The inspector's questions. He suspects me because of the arsenic prescription." His voice held a bitter edge. "But I treated the Colonel's rheumatism honourably. That land argument was mere disagreement." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Disagreements can escalate, like a fever unchecked. And Netherby does it play a part?" Dr. Thorpe stiffened. "Netherby, what do you know of that?" "Only whispers," she said innocently. "Connections, perhaps, to the Colonel's plans." The doctor exhaled sharply. "He wanted to sell to developers tied to Netherby interests. I opposed it for the village's sake. But poison, I'd never stoop to that." As he spoke, Miss Marple observed, his hands steady, but knuckles white. She recalled the fete, his proximity to the stall, his eyes on the jam. "Of course," she murmured, "but alibis are fragile things. Where were you just before the gathering?" "At my surgery," he replied quickly, "seeing a patient," but his glance averted, and Miss Marple sensed a crack in his composure. The garden's whispers grew as villagers passed, their conversations snippets of suspicion. One woman mentioned Lydia's herbal brews, potent enough to fell a horse. Another spoke of Mrs. Hargrove's jealousy over the Colonel's attentions to a parish volunteer. Miss Marple absorbed it all, her mind weaving a web of possibilities. Returning to the vicarage, she found Inspector Harlan in the pantry, examining jars with a magnifying glass. "No tampering evident," he grumbled, but the toast was laced. Perhaps a syringe injected through the seal. Miss Marple nodded, or replaced entirely. "Jars look alike, Inspector." He grunted, dismissing her, but she persisted. "The Netherby connection worth exploring." Harlan's interest piqued. "Netherby first, I've heard. Affair, investments," she said vaguely. "Whispers in the garden." The inspector made a note, his skepticism evident, but Miss Marple knew seeds planted could grow. As evening fell, shadows lengthened. mirroring the deepening mystery. Miss Marple, back at Margaret's cottage, reflected by the fire. Whispers revealed motives: jealousy, greed, fear, but which led to murder. In St. Mary Mead, such threads had unravelled scandals. Here, they would do the same. The garden's secrets, like buried roots, would surface in time. Chapter 5. The Second Shadow, the Tranquility of Elmwood. Already strained by Colonel Baxter's sudden death, shattered like a dropped teacup 3 days later, the village, still murmuring over the arsenic-laced jam, was unprepared for another. Below, Miss Jane Marple, seated in Margaret's cosy parlour, was knitting a pale blue shawl when the news arrived. Carried by a breathless Miss Clara Beale, the postmistress burst through the cottage door, her hat askew, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement that only calamity could ignite. Miss Marple, Margaret, it's dreadful, Lydia Finch is dead. Found this morning in her room at the vicarage. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Miss Marple's needles paused only briefly before resuming their steady rhythm. Dead, you say? She murmured, her voice calm but her eyes sharp with interest. How, Miss Beale? Poison, they think. Miss Beale replied, sinking into a chair. Arsenic, like the Colonel. She was eating a spoonful of that wretched plum jam Mrs. Hargroves from the kitchen. Collapsed right there. They say Dr. Thorpe tried to save her, but it was too late. Miss Marple's mind, as keen as the pins in her knitting bag, began to sort through this new thread in the tapestry of Elmwood's tragedy. 2 deaths, both tied to the same jam, suggested either a chilling coincidence or a deliberate pattern. When did this happen? She asked, her tone deceptively mild. Last night, late, Miss Beale said, eager to share every detail. She was alone, they say, after supper. The vicar found her this morning when she didn't come down for breakfast. Oh, the village is in an uproar. Margaret, pale and trembling, looked to her aunt. Aunt Jane, this is too awful. 2 people, poisoned by the same jam. Could it be a mistake, a bad batch? Perhaps. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. Mistakes, my dear, are rarely so precise. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a case where a poisoned cake killed only 1 guest at a tea party. The answer lay not in the cake, but in who served it. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I think we should visit the vicarage. There is much to learn. The vicarage was a scene of controlled chaos when Miss Marple and Margaret arrived. Inspector Harlan, summoned from the county station, stood in the hallway, his face grim as he issued orders to his men. The vicar, his clerical calm frayed, hovered near the staircase, while Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove sat in the drawing-room, her hands clasped tightly, her face a mask of shock. Dr. Lionel Thorpe, summoned to confirm the death, was just leaving Lydia's room, his medical bag in hand and his expression one of weary resignation. Inspector, Miss Marple greeted her, presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. A terrible turn of events. May I ask what you found? Harlan, though initially dismissive of the elderly spinster, had begun to respect her quiet insights. Miss Finch, dead from arsenic poisoning, he said brusquely. A spoonful of jam from the vicarage kitchen, left on her bedside table. Same symptoms as the Colonel: convulsions, rapid collapse. The lab's testing the jam now, but I'd wager it's the same as before. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the staircase leading to Lydia's room. Might I see the scene, Inspector? Sometimes, the smallest details. She trailed off, her tone suggesting nothing more than polite curiosity. Harlan hesitated, then nodded, Briefly, Miss Marple, but don't touch anything." He led the way upstairs, Margaret trailing behind, her eyes wide with apprehension. Lydia Finch's room was small but tidy, with a single bed, a dresser, and a shelf of books. On herbal lore. On the bedside table stood a saucer with a smear of plum jam, a spoon beside it, its handle gleaming in the morning light. The window was slightly ajar, letting in a breeze that stirred the curtains. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the faint scent of lavender, the neatly folded shawl on the chair, and a single sheet of paper tucked under a book, its edge just visible. She made no move to touch it, but her eyes lingered. "Poor Lydia," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She was so reserved, but kind in her way. Who would do this? Miss Marple's response was a gentle pat on her niece's arm. "Kindness, my dear, can mask many things, and so can reserve." She turned to the inspector. "The jam, was it from the same jar as the Colonel's?" "That's the puzzle," Harlan admitted, rubbing his chin. "Mrs. Hargrove insists the kitchen jar was untouched since the fete. Yet here we are, another death. I'm sealing the vicarage until we sort this out." Downstairs, Mrs. Hargrove was questioned again, her voice trembling as she recounted the evening. "Lydia took a jar from the kitchen after supper," she said. "She often had a late snack, bread and jam. Nothing unusual, I didn't think. Oh, how could this happen again?" Her eyes filled with tears, and the vicar, standing beside her, murmured words of comfort. Inspector Harlan's attention turned to Dr. Thorpe, who stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid. "Doctor, you examined Miss Finch. Anything unusual?" Thorpe shook his head. "Classic arsenic poisoning, identical to the Colonel's. I tried to administer an antidote, but she was gone before I could act. The jam was the only thing she'd consumed recently, according to the vicar." Miss Marple, seated quietly, observed the room's dynamics. Mrs. Hargrove's distress seemed genuine, but there was a tightness in her jaw that suggested more than grief. The vicar's hands fidgeted, as if longing to clasp something other than his wife's shoulder. Dr. Thorpe's calm was too studied, his eyes avoiding the jar on the sideboard, which matched the one in Lydia's room. And the memory of Lydia's wariness, her herbal knowledge, lingered like a shadow. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "might I suggest examining the pantry again? 2 jars, to deaths perhaps. They are not as identical as they seem." Harlan raised an eyebrow but nodded, leading the way to the pantry. The shelves were as orderly as before, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a detail she had noted previously: 2 jars of plum jam, one labeled Fate Special, the other plain. She pointed to them, her voice casual. "Curious, don't you think? Jam doesn't usually have twins." The inspector frowned, lifting both jars. "They look the same to me. Same batch, surely." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "But labels can be changed, and jars swapped. In St. Mary Mead, a similar case involved a bottle of sherry identical, until one tasted of almonds." Harlan grunted, unconvinced, but ordered both jars sent for analysis. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to motive. Colonel Baxter's death had stirred talk of his will, his Netherby connections, his disputes with Dr. Thorpe. Lydia Finch, with her herbal expertise, had been a convenient suspect, too convenient, perhaps. Her death suggested either a second target or a mistake. Or, Miss Marple mused, a killer covering their tracks. The village buzzed with speculation as news of Lydia's death spread. At the post office, Miss Beale recounted the tragedy to every customer, adding flourishes about Lydia's secretive nature. At the tea shop, whispers linked her to the Colonel's demise, suggesting she had poisoned him and then, in a twist of fate, fallen victim herself. Miss Marple, pausing for a cup of tea on her way back to the cottage, listened to these tales, sifting truth from embellishment. Margaret, walking beside her, was near tears. "Aunt Jane, it's too much. First the Colonel, now Lydia. Is the whole village cursed?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the lane ahead. "Not cursed, my dear. Merely human, and humans, when pressed, reveal their darker sides." She thought of the jars, the smudged label, the paper in Lydia's room. "We must look closer," she added. "The second shadow often hides the first." Back at the cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her mind elsewhere. The jam had killed twice, but the how and why remained elusive. Was Lydia a victim or a perpetrator caught in her own trap? Was the poison meant for another? In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled such knots before. In Elmwood, she would do so again, one stitch at a time. Chapter 6. Motives unveiled. The village of Elmwood, once a haven of pastoral serenity, now simmered with unease, its lanes alive with hushed conversations and sidelong glances. The deaths of Colonel Baxter and Lydia Finch, both linked to Mrs. Hargrove's plum jam, had woven a thread of fear through the community, as if the very air carried a trace of poison. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her niece Margaret's parlour, knitted with a steady hand, her needles clicking like a metronome. Against the backdrop of the morning's quiet, outside, the church bell tolled for Sunday service, but the sombre notes seemed to echo the village's mood rather than lift it. Margaret, setting a teapot on the table, broke the silence. "Aunt Jane, I can't bear it. 2 deaths in a week, and everyone looking at each other as if they're hiding something. Do you think the inspector will find the truth?" Her voice wavered, her usual cheer dimmed by the weight of recent events. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, met her niece's. "Truth, my dear, is like a garden. Weed it persists, no matter how deeply buried. Inspector Harlan is thorough, but thoroughness alone misses the subtleties of human nature." She sipped her tea, her mind sifting through the fragments of the case. The Colonel's collapse, Lydia's solitary death, the clean jars, the whispered motives. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how small grievances could fester into deadly acts. Elmwood, she suspected, held similar secrets by mid-morning. Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where Inspector Harlan had convened another round of interviews. The drawing room, once a place of warm hospitality, now felt like a courtroom, its air thick with tension. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove sat by the window, her face pale but composed, her hands folded in her lap. The vicar, Reverend Hargrove, stood beside her, his expression one of strained patience. Dr. Lionel Thorpe, summoned yet again, leaned against the mantelpiece, his scholarly demeanour tinged with weariness. The absence of Lydia Finch was palpable, her empty chair a silent accusation. Inspector Harlan, his notebook ever present, began with Mrs. Hargrove. "Mrs. Hargrove, let's go over it again. The jam in Miss Finch's room taken from the kitchen, you say. Who else had access that evening?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice was steady, though her eyes betrayed her distress. "Only the vicar and I were in the house after supper. Lydia took the jar herself, saw her carry it upstairs. The pantry is always open to her. She's part of the household." She hesitated, then added, "I can't imagine how it was poisoned. The lab said the fate jar was clean, and this one." Her voice faltered, and she looked to her husband for support. The vicar nodded. "It's true, Inspector. Lydia was family to us. No one else was here, no strangers, no visitors." His hands clasped tightly, as if to anchor his composure. Harlan turned to Dr. Thorpe. "And you, Doctor, too. You were here briefly that evening, checking on Mrs. Hargrove after the Colonel's death. Did you see Miss Finch with a jam?" Thorpe's jaw tightened. "I saw her in the hall, yes, holding a jar. I assumed it was for her supper. I was only here a moment. Mrs. Hargrove was understandably upset, and I prescribed a mild sedative." His tone was clipped, his eyes avoiding the sideboard where another jar of jam sat, its label gleaming in the sunlight. Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, observed the interplay. She noted the vicar's quick glance at his wife, Mrs. Hargrove's faint flush at the mention of the sedative, and Dr. Thorpe's careful choice of words. The room, she thought, was a stage where each player concealed as much as they revealed. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a poisoned cordial had unmasked a web of envy. Here, the jam was proving equally revealing. The inspector's questions shifted to motives. "Colonel Baxter," he said, addressing the room, "had enemies, it seems. That land dispute with you, Dr. Thorpe, to elaborate." Thorpe sighed, his fingers drumming lightly on the mantel. "It was professional, not personal. The Colonel wanted to sell the Riverside plot to developers from Netherby. I argued it should remain green, perhaps for a community clinic. We disagreed, but I bore him no ill will." His words were measured, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of intensity in his eyes, as if the dispute had cut deeper than he admitted. "And Miss Finch," Harlan pressed. "Any conflicts with her?" Mrs. Hargrove spoke up, her voice sharp. "Lydia was difficult at times. She kept to herself, but she had a way of knowing things, village secrets, you might say. She once hinted at something about my youth, a mistake long buried." Her lips tightened, and she looked away, as if regretting her candor. The vicar interjected, his tone protective. "Eleanor, there's no need. Lydia was a friend, not a gossip. She meant no harm." But his words lacked conviction, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind noting the couple's unease. Harlan scribbled in his notebook, "Secrets, eh? And what about the Colonel's will?" Mr. Wren mentioned a charity bequest. "Parish benefits, Vic." Reverend Hargrove flushed. "The Colonel was generous, yes. He supported our work with the poor, but I never pressed him. It was his choice." His eyes darted to his wife, and Miss Marple wondered if the bequest had stirred tensions within. The vicarage. As the interviews continued, new threads emerged. Miss Clara Beale, called to confirm her earlier gossip, revealed that Lydia had been seen arguing with Colonel Baxter days before the fete. "Something about her herbs," Miss Beale said, her voice eager. "He called her a quack, said he'd expose her remedies as fraud." Lydia was furious quietly, mind you, but you could see it in her eyes. Dr. Thorpe, questioned again, admitted to prescribing arsenic for the Colonel's rheumatism months earlier. A standard treatment then, he insisted, but the bottle was at his home, not here. I checked his records in our recent refills. His alibi for the night of Lydia's death was vaguer. He claimed to have been at his surgery, alone, reviewing patient files. Miss Marple, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the room's tension, reflected on these revelations. Lydia's knowledge of secrets The Colonel's will, the land disputes all, were motives, each pointing to a different hand. Yet the jam, that innocuous preserve, linked the deaths. She recalled the 2 jars in the pantry, one labelled Fate Special, the other plain. The smudge on one label nagged at her, a detail as small but significant as a dropped stitch. After the interviews, Miss Marple requested to see Lydia's room again, with Harlan's grudging permission. The space was unchanged, the saucer with its jam residue, the open window, the paper under the book. She approached the dresser, her fingers brushing the book's edge. The paper she saw was a letter, its handwriting bold but shaky. She didn't touch it, knowing the inspector's rules, but her eyes scanned the visible lines. Your threats will not silence me. The signature was obscured, but the tone suggested confrontation. Inspector, she called softly, this letter, have you examined it? Harlan joined her, lifting the paper with gloved hands. Threats, eh? Looks like the Colonel's hand, but it's dated after his death. A forgery, perhaps. He bagged it for analysis, his skepticism clear. Miss Marple's mind word. Forged letter, or one written under duress. In St. Mary Mead, a similar note had unmasked a blackmailer. Here, it might point to the killer or a victim. She descended to the drawing room, where Mrs. Hargrove was now alone, staring at the sideboard's jar. Mrs. Hargrove, Miss Marple said gently, your jammet's made from wild plums, yes. From the orchard. Mrs. Hargrove nodded, her eyes distant. Yes, from the old trees by the river. My grandmother's recipe, handed down. I picked them myself. Her voice held a trace of pride, quickly overshadowed by grief. The river, Miss Marple mused. Near the disputed land, perhaps. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes flickered, but she said nothing, and Miss Marple let the question hang, like a thread waiting to be pulled. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked back to the cottage, the village bathed in twilight's glow. Motives were unveiling themselves. Greed for the will's bequest, anger over land, fear of exposed secrets. Yet the jam's role remained elusive. Was it a weapon wielded twice, or a trap that caught its own maker? By the fire, her knitting. Resumed, Miss Marple pondered the human heart, its desires as tangled as the wool in her hands. The truth, she knew, was close, waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 7. The Hidden Letter. The Village of Elmwood, now cloaked in the sombre hues of late summer, seemed to hold its breath as the mystery of the plum jam deepened. 2 deaths, both tied to Mrs. Hargrove's preserves, had cast a pall over the community, turning neighbours into suspects and whispers into accusations. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table in her niece Margaret's cottage, sipped her tea with a calm that belied the storm of thoughts in her mind. Her knitting lay idle for once, her fingers instead tracing the rim of her cup as she pondered the threads of the case. Colonel Baxter's collapse, Lydia Finch's solitary end, the clean jars, and the web of motives that entangled the inhabitants. Margaret, her face drawn from sleepless nights, set a plate of scones before her aunt. Aunt Jane, the village is in pieces. People are saying Lydia poisoned the Colonel and then herself, out of guilt. But I can't believe it. Lydia was so careful, so precise. What do you think? Her voice was a mix of hope and dread, seeking reassurance from the elderly spinster, whose quiet wisdom had unravelled many a knot. Miss Marple's eyes, bright with perception, met her niece's. Guilt, my dear, is a heavy burden, but it rarely leads to such a tidy conclusion. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a woman who seemed guilty of theft, only to be protecting another. We must look beyond the obvious. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirt. I think a visit to the vicarage is in order. There are pieces missing, and they may lie in the smallest corners. The vicarage stood under a grey sky, its ivy-clad walls seeming to sag under the weight of recent events. Inspector Harlan was already there, his motorcar parked askew, a sign of his growing frustration. Inside, the drawing room was a tableau of strained civility. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove sat by the fire, her hands twisting a handkerchief. The vicar, Reverend Hargrove, paced near the window, his clerical collar slightly askew. Dr. Lionel Thorpe stood by the bookcase, his scholarly air tempered by a visible tension. The absence of Lydia Finch was a void that seemed to draw every eye. Her death, a fresh wound in the household. Inspector Harlan, his notebook open, was reviewing the latest lab results. The jam from Miss Finch's room, he announced, his voice clipped, contained arsenic, just as we suspected. But here's the rub: the jar itself, like the one from the fete, shows no trace of poison in the remaining contents. It's as if only the spoonful she took was tainted. He rubbed his mustache, his brow furrowed. This suggests deliberate tampering, not a contaminated batch. Mrs. Hargrove's face crumpled. But how, Inspector? The jar was in the kitchen, untouched until Lydia took it. I swear I made it myself. Wild plums, sugar, nothing else. Her voice broke, and the vicar moved to her side, murmuring words of comfort that seemed to do little to ease her distress. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively with her knitting resumed, listened intently. The pattern was emerging, but it was as intricate as the lace shawl taking shape in her hands. She recalled the letter she had glimpsed in Lydia's room, its bold handwriting and threatening tone. Inspector, she said softly, the letter you found in Miss Finch's room. Have the analysts confirmed its authenticity? Harlan glanced at her, his skepticism tempered by a grudging respect. They're working on it, Miss Marple. The handwriting resembles Colonel Baxter's, but the date, 2 days after his death, makes no sense. Either it's a forgery or someone's playing a clever game. He turned to Dr. Thorpe. Doctor, you knew the Colonel's hand. Any thoughts? Thorpe's fingers tightened on the book he held, a medical text. It looked like his writing, but I can't be certain. He was a private man, kept his correspondence close. If it's a forgery, it's a good one. His tone was guarded, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to the vicar, as if gauging his reaction. The inspector pressed on, addressing Mrs. Hargrove, and this business of Miss Finch knowing secret scare to elaborate. You mentioned she hinted at something from your past. Mrs. Hargrove flushed, her hands stilling. It was nothing, really. A youthful indiscretion, long forgotten. Lydia had a way of probing, but I never thought her malicious. Her voice trembled, and she looked to her husband, who nodded reassuringly but said nothing. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her mind turning over the letter. A threat, dated impossibly, suggested either a desperate act or a calculated misdirection. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a forged note had concealed a deeper truth, and she wondered if this letter was a similar sleight of hand. Inspector, she ventured, might we examine the letter's paper? Sometimes, the smallest mark or crease, an impression tells its own story. Harlan raised an eyebrow, but signaled to his sergeant, who produced the letter, now sealed, in a plastic sleeve. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the document through the clear covering. The handwriting was indeed bold, but there were faint indentations, as if another sheet had been pressed beneath it. "Curious," she murmured. "It's as if this was written over another note. Perhaps the original holds the key." The inspector made a note, his interest piqued. "We'll have the lab check for impressions. But why forge a letter from a dead man? To frame someone, perhaps." His gaze swept the room, lingering on Dr. Thorpe, who shifted uncomfortably. As the morning progressed, more details emerged. Miss Clara Beale, summoned again, confirmed the Colonel's frequent letters to Netherby, adding that he had recently received a package from their small box, contents unknown. He was secretive about it, she said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of disclosure. Tucked it under his arm and hurried home. The vicar, questioned about the charity bequest, grew defensive. Colonel Baxter's gift was unsolicited, he insisted. "We discussed it once, months ago. He wanted to support the parish's work, nothing more." But his hands betrayed his unease. Twisting the edge of his cassock, Dr. Thorpe pressed about his whereabouts on the night of Lydia's death, reiterated his alibi, alone at his surgery, reviewing files. "No one can confirm it," he admitted. "But I had no reason to harm Lydia. She was eccentric, but harmless." His words were careful, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something fear, perhaps, in his eyes. After the interviews, Miss Marple requested to revisit the pantry, her curiosity drawn to the 2 jars she had noted before. With Harlan's permission, she examined them again, her fingers brushing the labels. The fate special jar had a faint smudge, as if the label had been reapplied. The plain jar, by contrast, was pristine, its seal unbroken. "Inspector," she said, "these jars might have been swapped. A poisoned jar introduced, perhaps, to replace the original." Harlan frowned, considering. Possible, but risky. Someone would have noticed a stranger in the kitchen. He ordered both jars retested, his patience thinning but his thoroughness intact. As the day wore on, Miss Marple strolled through the vicarage garden, her thoughts on the letter and the jars. The orchard, where Mrs. Hargrove's wild plums grew, was near the disputed riverside land, a fact that nagged at her. She paused by a plum tree, its branches heavy with fruit, and recalled the vicar's mention of arsenic-laden soil from old mines nearby. Yet the lab had ruled out natural contamination. The poison, then, was deliberate, but by whose hand? Back at the cottage, Margaret was waiting, her anxiety palpable. Aunt Jane, that letter, it's so strange. Why would Lydia have it? And dated after the Colonel's death. Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. "A letter, my dear, is like a stitch in a pattern. It can hold things together or unravel them entirely. This one, I think, is meant to mislead. But in St. Mary Mead, I learned that even misdirection points to the truth." Her eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. The hidden letter, with its impossible date and threatening words, was a puzzle piece that didn't fit yet. As the village settled into an uneasy night, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads of motive and opportunity. The Colonel's will, Lydia's secrets, the land dispute, the Netherby connection, the jam, that sweet veneer, concealed a bitter truth, and she was determined to taste it. Chapter 8. A midnight visitor. The night had draped Elmwood in a velvet hush, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of leaves stirred by a restless breeze. Miss Jane Marple, unable to sleep, sat by the window of her niece, Margaret's cottage, her knitting abandoned on the table beside her. The moonlight silvered the garden outside, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with secrets. Her mind, ever active, replayed the events of the past days. Colonel Baxter's collapse, Lydia Finch's solitary death, the enigmatic letter, and the twin jars of plum jam that seemed to mock the simplicity of village life in St. Mary Mead. She had learned that darkness often cloaked the truth, and tonight she felt it stirring. Margaret, exhausted by the week's turmoil, had retired early, leaving Miss Marple alone with her thoughts. The elderly spinster's eyes, sharp despite the hour, scanned the lane leading to the vicarage. Something about the case nagged at her a loose thread in the tapestry of motives and opportunities. The letter in Lydia's room, dated impossibly after Colonel Baxter's death, suggested a deliberate attempt to confuse or accuse the jars. One smudged and one pristine hinted at tampering, but by whom, and why a second death so soon after the first? As the village clock struck midnight, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A figure, cloaked in shadow, moved stealthily along the vicarage garden wall, pausing by the plum orchard. Miss Marple leaned closer to the window, her breath catching. The figure was tall, its movements purposeful, and it carried something, a bag, perhaps, or a tool. It vanished into the orchard, where the wild plums grew, their fruit the source of Mrs. Hargrove's fatal jam. Her heart quickened, not with fear, but with the thrill of discovery. "How very interesting," she murmured, reaching for her shawl. She considered waking Margaret, but decided against it. Her niece would only fret. Instead, Miss Marple slipped on her coat and sturdy shoes, her movements as quiet as the night itself. Armed with nothing but her keen observation and a small torch from Margaret's kitchen, she stepped into the cool air, her steps light on the cobbled path. The vicarage loomed ahead, its windows dark save for a faint glow in the kitchen. The figure, she reasoned, might be investigating or covering tracks. The orchard was a maze of shadows, the plum trees casting gnarled silhouettes against the moonlit grass. Miss Marple moved cautiously, her torch off to preserve her night vision. She heard a faint scraping like metal on earth near the base of a tree. Creeping closer, she saw the figure now, recognizable as Dr. Lionel Thorpe, kneeling, a trowel in hand, digging at the roots. His face, illuminated briefly by a match he struck to light a cigarette, was taut with concentration. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. "Dr. Thorpe, a curious hour for gardening, don't you think?" The doctor started, dropping the trowel with a muffled clatter. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, his voice a mix of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same," she replied, her tone mild but her eyes piercing. "The orchard, I understand, is where Mrs. Hargrove's plums are gathered. Are you looking for something, or burying it?" Thorpe stood, brushing soil from his hands. "I'm collecting soil samples," he said, his voice steady but his eyes avoiding hers. "The inspector mentioned arsenic in the soiled mine runoff. Perhaps I thought it worth checking for the village's safety." His explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hand, the way his cigarette glowed too brightly as he inhaled. "Very civic-minded," she said, her voice betraying no skepticism. "But at midnight, surely daylight would serve better." She stepped closer, her torch flicking on to illuminate the small hole he had dug. A glint of metal caught her azure glass vial, half buried, its label smeared but legible. Arsenic. Medicinal use. Thorpe's face paled. It's from my surgery, yes, but I didn't put it here." "Someone must have." He stopped, realizing his words sounded desperate. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. In St. Mary Mead, I once found a bottle of laudanum hidden in a rosebed. It solved the theft, but raised more questions. Perhaps you should inform Inspector Harlan of this find. Her tone was gentle, but it carried the weight of suggestion. Thorpe nodded, his jaw tight. I will, in the morning. I didn't want to alarm anyone tonight. He gathered his trowel and bag, retreating toward the vicarage gate, his silhouette merging with the shadows. Miss Marple lingered, her torch sweeping the ground. The vial, she noted, was partially covered, as if hastily concealed. She made no move to touch it, knowing the inspector's forensic team would need it undisturbed. But her mind raced. Was Thorpe planting evidence to deflect suspicion, or had he stumbled upon another's attempt to do so? The orchard, with its wild plums, was central to the mystery. Its soil perhaps holding more than arsenic. Returning to the cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts elsewhere. The midnight visitor had added a new thread to the tapestry. Dr. Thorpe, with his shaky alibi and medical knowledge, was now linked to a vial of poison. Yet his surprise seemed genuine, his actions more those of a man searching than scheming. She recalled the letter in Lydia's room, the smudged jar label, the whispers of Netherby and land disputes. Each piece pointed to a different player, but the jam remained the constant. Morning brought a summons from Inspector Harlan, who had been informed of the orchard incident by Dr. Thorpe himself. At the vicarage, the inspector was grim, holding the bagged vial. Found this at dawn, thanks to the doctor's tip, he said, eyeing Miss Marple curiously. You saw him digging, you say? I did, she replied, her voice soft. He claimed to be testing the soil. A reasonable explanation, but the hour was unusual. She paused, then added, the vial, does it match the arsenic used in the poisonings? Harlan nodded. Preliminary tests suggest so, but it's old, possibly from the Colonel's prescription. Thorpe swears he didn't hide it, but his fingerprints are on it. He rubbed his mustache, frustrated. He's either careless or being framed. Mrs. Hargrove, present in the drawing room, gasped. Framed? But who would do such a thing? Her eyes darted to the vicar, who stood silently, his face pale. Dr. Thorpe, questioned again, reiterated his story, his composure fraying. I found the vial while digging, he insisted. Someone placed it there to implicate me. Miss Marple, her knitting a quiet rhythm, considered the players. Mrs. Hargrove's distress, the vicar's silence, Thorpe's midnight errandle suggested layers of deception. She recalled the orchard's proximity to the disputed land, the whispers of Netherby's influence. Inspector, she said, might you check the vicarage's visitor's log? A stranger, perhaps, from Netherby. Harlan grunted, but made a note. Worth a look. But this vial points to Thorpe. He dismissed the group, his focus on the doctor. As Miss Marple walked back to the cottage, the village waking around her, she pondered the midnight visitor. In St. Mary Mead, a late-night prowler had unmasked a thief. Here, the truth was murkier. The vial, the letter, the Jamal, were pieces in a puzzle that grew more complex with each shadow cast. By the fire, that evening, her needles clicking, Miss Marple knew the truth was near, waiting to be illuminated like the orchard under the moon. Chapter 9. The forgotten Wilfer morning mist clung to Elmwood's lanes, softening the outlines of stone cottages and lending an air of unreality to the village, as if it were a stage set for a tragedy yet to fully unfold. Miss Jane Marple, seated at Margaret's breakfast table, sipped her tea with the quiet deliberation of one who saw patterns where others saw only chaos. The deaths of Colonel Baxter and Lydia Finch, both tied to the sinister thread of Mrs. Hargrove's plum jam, had woven a web of suspicion that ensnared the vicarage and beyond. Her knitting lay untouched, her mind too occupied with the latest threads, the midnight vial, the threatening letter, and the whispers of motives that swirled like leaves in the autumn breeze. Margaret, setting out a plate of toast, broke the silence. "Aunt Jane, the village is buzzing about Dr. Thorpe's midnight digging. Do you think he's guilty? That violet's damning, isn't it?" Her voice held a mix of fear and curiosity, her eyes searching her aunt's face for reassurance. Miss Marple's gaze was steady, her expression serene. "Damning, my dear, is a strong word. Evidence can be as deceptive as a smile in a drawing room. In St. Mary Mead, I once saw a man accused of theft because his gloves were found at the scene, to learn they'd been planted by a jealous rival." She patted Margaret's hand. "We must wait and see what the will reveals." The will, Colonel Baxter's last testament, had become a topic of fervent speculation since Miss Clara Beale's gossip about its revision. That morning, Mr. Percival Wren, Margaret's husband and the village solicitor, arrived at the vicarage with a leather folder under his arm, summoned by Inspector Harlan to discuss the document. Miss Marple, invited as a courtesy due to her persistent presence, accompanied Margaret, her black handbag, a familiar accessory as they entered the vicarage's somber drawing room. Inspector Harlan stood by the fireplace, his mustache bristling. With the intensity of a man wrestling with a puzzle that refused to yield, Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove sat rigidly, her hands clasped, while the vicar hovered nearby, his face etched with worry. Dr. Lionel Thorpe, under increasing scrutiny, was absent, detained at the police station for further questioning about the arsenic vial. The air was heavy with unspoken questions, the memory of Lydia's empty chair a stark reminder of the case's toll. Mr. Wren opened his folder, producing a sheaf of papers. "Inspector, this is Colonel Baxter's will, updated just 10 days. Before his death," he said, his voice precise but tinged with unease. "He disinherited his nephew, citing personal differences, and left the bulk of his estate to a charity run by the vicarage for the relief of the poor. There's also a bequest to Dr. Thorpe's clinic for equipment upgrades." He paused, glancing at the vicar. "Miss Lydia Finch was a witness to the codicil, alongside myself." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Lydia Finch, a witness, and now she's dead. Convenient, perhaps." He turned to the vicar. "This charity or parish benefits greatly, I presume?" Reverend Hargrove flushed, his hands fidgeting. "The colonel was moved by our work, Inspector. I advised him on the charity's needs, but I never pressed for such a sum. It was his decision." His voice was earnest, but Miss Marple noted a slight tremor, as if the weight of the bequest carried a hidden burden. Mrs. Hargrove spoke up, her voice sharp. "Lydia was proud to witness the will. She believed in the charity's mission. Surely you don't think?" Her words trailed off, her eyes darting to her husband. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, observed the exchange. The will, she thought, was a pivot point, shifting motives like shadows in a storm. The charity bequest enriched the vicarage, but at what cost? And Lydia's role as witness, had it made her a target? She recalled the letter in Lydia's room, its threatening tone, an impossible date. "Mr. Wren," she said softly, "the codicils, signature Lydia's, you say. Did it appear authentic?" Wren hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. At the time, yes. But now, with her death, I've looked again. The signature is slightly off, perhaps rushed. I can't be certain without expert analysis. His admission hung in the air, a new thread of doubt. Harlan seized on it, a forged signature that changes things. If someone tampered with the will, it points to motive greed, perhaps. He made a note, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, her mind weaving connections. The will, the letter, the jamel were linked, but how? She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a forged document had concealed a family secret. Here, the stakes seemed higher, the players more desperate. Inspector, she ventured, might the Netherby connection tie to the will? The Colonel's correspondence, there perhaps it influenced his decisions. Harlan grunted, his skepticism evident. Netherby again. Miss Beale mentioned letters, but nothing concrete. I've sent a constable to inquire. He turned to Wren. Any record of Netherby in the Colonel's papers? Wren shook his head. Only his personal letters, which he kept private. But he did mention investors from Netherby interested in the riverside land. It caused tension. With Dr. Thorpe. His glance at the vicar was brief, as if wary of stirring more suspicion. The vicar spoke, his voice strained. The land dispute was no secret. The Colonel wanted to sell. Dr. Thorpe wanted it preserved. But it's unrelated to the will or the poisonings. His protest sounded hollow, and Miss Marple noted Mrs. Hargrove's tightened lips, as if she feared her husband's words revealed too much. As the meeting adjourned, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the sideboard where a jar of plum jam still stood, its label pristine. She approached Mrs. Hargrove, her tone gentle. Your jam, Mrs. Hargrove, made from the orchard plums, near the disputed land. Did anyone else help with the picking? Mrs. Hargrove's eyes widened, then narrowed. No, just me. It's my ritual, always has been. The plums are perfect, they're wild, untouched. Her voice held a note of defiance, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease. Returning to the cottage, Miss Marple walked through the village, where whispers followed her like a breeze. At the post office, Miss Beale was regaling customers with tales of the will's charity bequest, hinting at the vicar's ambition. At the tea shop, villagers speculated about Lydia's signature, some suggesting she'd been coerced. Miss Marple listened, her mind sifting truth from rumour by the fire that evening. Her knitting resumed. She reflected on the forgotten will. Its bequests to the charity, to Dr. Thorpe's clinic pointed to motives of greed and betrayal. Lydia's role as witness, now questioned, suggested manipulation. The Netherby letters, the disputed land, the arsenic vial were threads in a tapestry growing ever more intricate. A will, she murmured to Margaret, is like a promise, and promises, when broken, can be deadly. As night fell, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the vicarage, where secrets lingered like dust in the corners. The forgotten will had unveiled new motives, but the jam remained the key, its sweetness a mask for poison. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled such deceits. In Elmwood, she would do the same, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 10. Red herrings abound the village of Elmwood. Its cobblestone lanes, bathed in the soft glow of a late summer morning, seemed to hold its secrets close, as if the very stones whispered of betrayal. The deaths of Colonel Baxter and Lydia Finch, both linked to the sinister thread of Mrs. Hargrove's plum jam, had turned neighbour against neighbour, each glance laden with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the small oak table in Margaret's cottage, sipped her tea with a calm that masked the whirl of her thoughts. Her knitting, a delicate shawl of pale lavender, lay beside her, its intricate pattern a mirror to the case's complexity. The forgotten will, the midnight vial, the threatening letterall, were threads in a tapestry that grew ever more tangled. Margaret, bustling about the kitchen, set a plate of biscuits before her aunt. Aunt Jane, the village, is in a state. They're saying Dr. Thorpe hid that vial to cover his tracks, but others think Lydia was the poisoner caught in her own trap. And now there's talk of the vicar buying rat poison. What does it all mean? Her voice trembled, her eyes searching for clarity. Miss Marple's gaze was gentle but piercing. It means, my dear, that we are swimming in red herrings. In St. Mary Mead, I once saw a case where every clue pointed to a different culprit, yet the truth lay in what was overlooked. We must be patient. She rose, smoothing her tweed skirts, her black handbag at the ready. Let us visit the vicar. The truth often hides in the spaces between words. The vicarage, its ivy-clad walls catching the morning light, stood as a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Inspector Harlan was already there, his motor car parked neatly, his demeanor one of barely contained frustration. The drawing room was a stage of tense civility. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove sat by the window, her face pale but resolute. The vicar, Reverend Hargrove, stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly. Dr. Lionel Thorpe, released from questioning but still under scrutiny, leaned against the wall, his scholarly air frayed. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, the memory of 2 deaths hanging like a fog. Harlan, his notebook open, addressed. The vicar. Reverend, we've had a report from the chemist in Netherby. You purchased rat poison last month. Contains arsenic, I'm told. Care to explain? His voice was sharp, his eyes fixed on the vicar's face. Reverend Hargrove flushed, his hands twisting. It was for the churchyard, Inspector. Rats were getting into the vestry. I used it weeks ago, and it's locked in the shed. Surely you don't think... His voice faltered, and Mrs. Hargrove's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing. Her face, Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, noted the couple's unease. Rat poison was a common enough purchase in a rural village, but its timing was unfortunate. She recalled a St. Mary Mead case where a gardener's poison had been misjudged as evidence, only to mask a deeper crime. Inspector, she said softly, might we confirm the shed's contents? A locked door can be opened by many keys. Harlan grunted, but sent his sergeant to check. He turned to Dr. Thorpe. And you doctored your fingerprints on that vial in the orchard. You claim it was planted, but your alibi for Lydia's death is thin. Alone at your surgery, no witnesses, anything to add. Thorpe's jaw tightened. I've told you, I found the vial while testing the soil. Someone placed it there to implicate me. As for my alibi, I was working late. Patient records don't keep themselves. His tone was defensive, his eyes avoiding the jar of jam on the sideboard, its label gleaming innocently. Mrs. Hargrove spoke, her voice trembling. This is madness. My jam, poisoned twice. I made it myself, from plums I picked. No one touched those jars but me. Her insistence was fervent, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward her husband, as if seeking confirmation. The inspector's attention shifted to the fete itself. Let's go back to the stall, he said. Miss Marple, you were there anything unusual? His tone suggested he expected little, but her insights had begun to earn his notice. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. The stall was crowded. Inspector hands reached for jars. Eyes watched jars. I noticed Colonel Baxter take one, but others handled them too. A distraction, a spilled cup, a child's cry could cover, a sleight of hand. She paused, her eyes twinkling faintly. And the discarded lid I found near the stall, with scratches as if pried open. Perhaps it's worth a look. Harlan's eyebrows rose. A lid, where is it? Miss Marple directed him to the fate's rubbish heap, where a constable retrieved a bent metal lid, its edge marked with faint scratches. Could be from any jar, Harlan muttered, but he bagged it for analysis, noting its similarity to the jam jar lids. As the questioning continued, villagers brought more rumors. The grocer recalled seeing the vicar near the chemist's shop, looking agitated. A farmer mentioned Dr. Thorpe's late night walks by the river near the disputed land. Miss Clara Beale, ever the font of gossip, whispered of Lydia's argument with the colonel over her herbal remedies, suggesting she might have tampered with the jam to silence him. Each tale was a red herring, clouding the truth like mist over. The river, not Miss Marple, excused to walk the vicarage garden, paused by the orchard. The plum trees, heavy with fruit, stood near the disputed land, their roots deep in soil that might once have held arsenic from old mines. Yet the lab had ruled out natural contamination. She stooped, examining the ground where Dr. Thorpe had dug, her fingers brushing the earth. No further vials appeared, but the act of digging suggested either guilt or discovery. Back inside, Harlan shared a new finding. The arsenic in Lydia's jam was diluted compared to the colonel's, suggesting either a different source or a less practiced hand. 2 killers, he mused aloud, then shook his head. Unlikely, more likely, a single poisoner, varying their method. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Or a mistake, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, a poisoned pie was meant for one, but killed another. Intent and outcome can differ. Her tone was mild, but her words planted a seed. The vicar questioned again, admitted to handling the jam jars during the fete setup. I helped Eleanor arrange the stall, he said, but I never opened them. His wife nodded, but her eyes were wary, as if guarding a secret dot. Dr. Thorpe pressed about the scratched lid, claimed ignorance. I was at the tea tent, not the stall, he said, but I saw Lydia lingering there, looking preoccupied. His words cast suspicion back on the dead woman, a convenient scapegoat. As the day waned, Miss Marple returned to the cottage, the village upsides with theories. At the tea shop, whispers linked the vicar's rat poison to the crimes, while others pointed to Thorpe's vial. Lydia's herbal knowledge remained a spectre, her death both a puzzle and a clue. By the fire, Miss Marple's knitting resumed her thoughts on the red herrings, the scratched lid, the diluted arsenic, the wills. Bequest all pointed in different directions, yet converged on the jam. Truth, she murmured to Margaret, is like a needle in a haystack. You must clear the straw to find it. The night settled over Elmwood, its secrets as thick as the mist. Miss Marple, her shawl half finished, knew the red herrings were distractions, but each held a grain of truth. The next stitch, she felt, would bring the pattern into focus. Chapter 11. The gathering storm. The skies over Elmwood darkened as the day progressed, heavy clouds rolling in from the west like harbingers of revelation. The village, already steeped in the chill of 2 unsolved poisonings, felt the weight of impending confrontation. Miss Jane Marple, her black handbag slung over her arm, walked the winding path to the vicarage with Margaret at her side. The air was thick with moisture, mirroring the tension that had built since Colonel Baxter's death and Lydia Finch's tragic follow-up. Her knitting, tucked away for the moment, was a symbol of the patterns she sought to unravel amid the storm of clues and mysteriections. Inspector Harlan had summoned the key figures for a reconstruction of the fete evening, hoping to jolt memories or expose inconsistencies. The vicarage drawing room, with its chintz, curtains and polished wood, was transformed into a makeshift theatre of the crime. Present were Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, her face drawn but her posture defiant. The vicar, Reverend Hargrove, fidgeting with his collar. Dr. Lionel Thorpe, his scholarly calm cracking under the strain. And Mr. Percival Wren, the solicitor, clutching his leather folder like a shield. Miss Clara Beale, the postmistress, hovered at the edges, her eyes alight with the drama. Harlan stood at the center, his voice authoritative. "We'll reenact the gathering after the fete. Mrs. Hargrove, you served the toast with jam. Show us exactly how." He gestured to a tray prepared with bread and a mock jar of jam, its label mimicking the fatal one. Mrs. Hargrove rose, her hands trembling slightly, as she spread the preserve on slices of toast. "Like this," she said, her voice steady despite the quiver. "I handed it to the Colonel first. He was eager, always was, for my jam." She passed a piece to the inspector, who took it gingerly, as if expecting poison. Miss Marple, seated in her usual corner, watched with keen eyes. She noted how Mrs. Hargrove's fingers lingered on the jar, how the vicar's gaze followed her movements, and how Dr. Thorpe shifted uneasily, his hands clasped tightly. In St. Mary Mead, such reconstructions had often revealed the subtle gestures that betrayed guilt. Here, she sensed a similar unveiling. "Dr. Thorpe," Harlan continued, "you were seated there, by the fireplace. Did you notice anything unusual?" Thorpe shook his head, but his eyes darted to the pantry door. A flicker Miss Marple caught. "Nothing," he replied. The Colonel ate heartily, then collapsed. The vicar interjected, his voice rising. "This is distressing, Inspector. Reliving that moment, my wife is innocent, I assure you." But his assurance sounded forced, and Mrs. Hargrove shot him a glance that mixed gratitude with warning. Harlan pressed on, turning to the solicitor. "Mr. Wren, you were present too. Will you mention the codicil benefiting Dr. Thorpe's clinic? Any tension over that?" Wren cleared his throat. The Colonel discussed it briefly. Yes, Dr. Thorpe was grateful, but there was no argument. Miss Marple's needles emerged, clicking softly as she spoke. "Gratitude, Mr. Wren, can sometimes mask resentment. In St. Mary Mead, a bequest led to envy among beneficiaries. Perhaps here, the clinic's gain was someone's loss." Her words hung in the air, stirring the room's unease. As the reconstruction proceeded, accusations began to fly. Dr. Thorpe pointed at Lydia's empty chair. Lydia was the herbalist. She had access to poisons. She argued with the Colonel over his threats to expose her remedies. Perhaps she poisoned him, then tasted her own trap by mistake. His voice was sharp, deflecting suspicion from himself. Mrs. Hargrove bristled. "Lydia was my friend. She wouldn't. But you, doctor, with your arsenic prescriptions, and that vial in the orchard. You opposed the Colonel's Landsalia clinic, needed that plot." Her eyes flashed, revealing a depth of emotion that surprised even her husband. The vicar stepped forward, his face flushed enough. "Eleanor, calm yourself. Dr. Thorpe is a colleague in charity work, but the land. The Colonel's development plans would have harmed the parish. His words, meant to soothe, only fueled the fire. Harlan intervened, his tone commanding. Let's focus on the jam. 2 deaths, 2 different doses. The Colonel's pure arsenic, Lydia's diluted, suggests either 2 hands or a clever variation. He eyed the group, his suspicion evident. Miss Marple, her knitting progressing, recalled the scratched lid from the fete remnants. Inspector, that lidded scratches match a key from Dr. Thorpe's office, perhaps. A tool to pry and reseal. Harlan nodded. Analysis had confirmed the match, a detail he now revealed. Thorpe paled. My keys. I lost one weeks ago. Anyone could have taken it. This is a frame-up. His protest was vehement, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his fingers drummed. The storm outside broke, rain lashing the windows as thunder rumbled. The room's atmosphere mirrored it, tensions crackling like lightning. Miss Beale, unable to contain herself, blurted, I saw the vicar by rat poison, and Mrs. Hargrove arguing with Lydia over some old scandal, and the Netherby letters. Colonel's affair there, perhaps jealousy drove someone mad. Mrs. Hargrove stood, her voice cutting through the din. Jealousy, Lydia hinted at my past of foolish youth. A romance ended badly. But I'd never harm her. Her confession hung, a new motive exposed. Blackmail, perhaps, or silenced secrets. The vicar's face drained of colour. Eleanor, no need to, but she waved him off, her eyes on Harlan. Check the pantry again. My recipe includes a touch of elderberry from the garden, harmless, but perhaps tampered. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft amid the tumult. Elderberry, Mrs. Hargrove, near Lydia's herbs. A substitution may be laced with arsenic. Her observation silenced the room, eyes turning to her. Harlan seized the thread. Sergeant, fetch samples from the garden. As the man departed, the group fell into uneasy quiet, rain pounding relentlessly. Miss Marple's mind would. The gathering storm had stripped away facades, Thorpe's lost key, the vicar's poison purchase, Mrs. Hargrove's secret, Lydia's threats. Yet the jam bound them, its sweetness a veil for bitterness. In St. Mary Mead, storms cleared the air. Here, she hoped, it would reveal the killer as the reconstruction ended. The suspects dispersed, their faces etched with dread. Miss Marple, walking home with Margaret through the downpour, reflected on the revelations. Storms, my dear, wash away illusions. The truth is emerging, like sunlight after rain. Her words were calm, but her eyes held the glint of certainty. The gathering storm had broken, and with it, the case's barriers. Chapter 12. The twist of fate. The storm that had battered Elmwood the previous day left the village refreshed. The air crisp and the lanes glistening with puddles that reflected the blue sky like scattered mirrors. Yet the calm was deceptive, a mere interlude in the gathering tempest of revelations. Miss Jane Marple, seated in Margaret's sunlit parlour, knitted with a focus that belied her wandering thoughts. The reconstruction had peeled back layers of deception, exposing raw nerves. Mrs. Hargrove's concealed past, Dr. Thorpe's dubious alibi, the vicar's uneasy denials, the plum jam, that innocuous domestic triumph, remained the enigma. Its poison a metaphor for the bitterness hidden in human hearts. Margaret, pouring tea, glanced at her aunt with concern. Aunt Jane, after yesterday's accusations, I fear for the vicarage. Mrs. Hargrove seemed so shaken, confessing that old scandal. Do you think Lydia was blackmailing her? Her voice was hushed, as if the walls might carry tales. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes twinkling with quiet insight. Blackmail, my dear, is a double-edged sword. It cuts both ways, often wounding the wielder. In St. Mary Mead, a similar whisper campaign led to tragedy, but the truth was more twisted than anyone imagined. She set her knitting aside. We must visit the vicarage once more. The storm has cleared the air. Perhaps it has washed away illusions too. The vicarage garden bloomed defiantly, roses heavy with raindrops, but the house itself exuded a palpable gloom. Inspector Harlan was there, his face etched with the weariness of a man chasing shadows. He had received reports from the lab. The elderberry in Mrs. Hargrove's recipe showed no tampering, but the garden soil near Lydia's herbs contained traces of arsenic, possibly from runoff or deliberate addition. It's inconclusive, he grumbled, pacing the drawing room. The diluted dose in Lydia's jam suggests a botched attempt, or perhaps a different motive. Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, pale but composed, sat with a cup of untouched tea. My recipe is simple. Inspector Plums, sugar, elderberry for depth. Lydia knew it. She even helped pick the berries once. Her voice held a note of sorrow, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on the saucer, as if gripping a secret. The vicar entered, his face ashen, carrying a small box. Inspector, this was in Lydia's room, hidden under the floorboards. I found it while tidying. He opened it to reveal a bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon. The top one bore Colonel Baxter's seal, its content a scrawled confession of an affair with Mrs. Hargrove's sister, years ago but recently rekindled in Netherby. Harlan's eyes widened. An affair with your sister, Mrs. Hargrove. The room stilled, the revelation hanging like thunder. Mrs. Hargrove's composure cracked. My sister, she wrote me about it, begging forgiveness. The colonel had promised to leave her, but instead he revised his will to cut off his nephew. Who knew of the liaison? Lydia must have discovered it her herbs, her prying ways. Tears welled, but her gaze hardened. I confronted him at the fete, but poison, never. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle. Confrontations, Mrs. Hargrove, can lead. 2 desperate acts. But let us examine the letters. With Harlan's permission, she scanned them, noting the fresh ink on one, post-dating the colonel's death. This one, she said, mirrors the threatening letter in Lydia's room. A forgery, perhaps, to frame or deflect. Dr. Thorpe arrived, summoned by the inspector, his face drawn from overnight questioning. The vial in the orchard, I swear it was planted. My fingerprints. I handled similar ones daily. His eyes met Mrs. Hargrove's, a silent plea or accusation passing between them. Harlan pressed him. Your key scratched, the light analysis confirms. And your opposition. To the land sale, the colonel's affair tied to Netherby developers, perhaps? Thorpe shook his head. I knew of his trips, but not the details. The land was for the clinic, yes, but murder. Absurd. The vicar, silent until now, spoke with a tremor. Inspector, the charity bequest was my idea, to aid the parish. But if the will's codicil is forged, as Lydia's signature suggests. His words trailed off, implication heavy. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing the fragments. The affair explained jealousy. The forged documents hinted at manipulation. The diluted arsenic suggested an amateur's hand or a calculated difference. A twist of fate, she murmured, where intent and accident collide. As the group dispersed for lunch, a somber affair of sandwiches, Miss Marple wandered the garden. her thoughts on Lydia, the herbalist's death, self-inflicted or not. She paused by the elderberry bush, fingering a leaf. Nearby, the plum orchard loomed, its fruit the source of the jam. A glint caught her Aja, discarded spoon, smeared with purple residue, half buried under leaves. "Inspector," she called. Harlan joined her, retrieving the spoon. From Lydia's room, perhaps, or another's. Lab tests later confirmed. Traces of arsenic, matching Lydia's dose. But the spoon's handle bore fingerprints. Thorpe's confronted. Thorpe broke. I swapped the jars," he confessed, his voice cracking. "Lydia was blackmailing me over embezzlement from the clinic funds money I borrowed for equipment, intending to repay with the will's bequest. She poisoned the Colonel's jam to eliminate his threats against her herbs, but I discovered her plan. I diluted the remaining jar to scare her, not kill. Fate twisted it. She ate more than expected." Harlan's eyes narrowed. "Swapped jars. So Lydia killed the Colonel, and you accidentally killed her," Miss Marple interjected softly. "But the fingerprints, doctor on the vial, the spoon, and the forged letter." Thorpe shook his head. "The letter was Lydia's doing, to frame the Colonel posthumously if needed. The vial I don't know." The vicar, overhearing, stepped forward. "The vial was mine. I buried it after using the rat poison, fearing implication. But I didn't poison anyone." Mrs. Hargrove gasped. Why hide it?" The vicar's shoulders slumped. "To protect you, Eleanor. Your sister's affair I knew and feared. You'd act in rage. But the jam, Lydia must have laced it, as Thorpe says." Miss Marple's eyes crinkled. "A twist, indeed. Lydia poisons the Colonel. Thorpe dilutes to warn. But fate delivers a fatal dose. Yet the fate jar was clean how?" Revelation struck. The fate special jar was swapped by Lydia herself, intending it for Thorpe, but the Colonel took it first. Lydia, in panic, sampled the diluted remainder. Her own poison turned against her. Harlan arrested Thorpe for manslaughter, but Miss Marple demurred. Fate's twist. Inspector Lydia's hand felled both, her scheme unraveling in irony. The village exhaled as truths emerged, but Miss Marple pondered deeper currents. The affair, the embezzlement, the forgeries all intertwined. Fate's capricious hand guiding the poison. Back at the cottage, rain threatening again, Miss Marple knitted on. "Twists of fate," she told Margaret, "are human designs gone awry. In St. Mary Mead, I saw such ironies. Here, they claim to lives." The case neared closure, but one thread lingered, pulling toward the final unraveling. Chapter 13. Unmasking the truth. The afternoon sun pierced the clouds over Elmwood, casting a patchwork of light and shadow on the vicarage garden, where the plum trees stood silent sentinels to the unfolding drama. Inside the drawing room, the air was thick with anticipation, a tension that hummed like the distant thunder of the previous day's storm. Inspector Harlan had assembled the suspects for what he called a final clarification, but Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary corner with her knitting in hand, knew it was the moment for truths to surface, like bubbles in a simmering pot. The plum jam that had killed twice was no longer just a preserve. It was a symbol of concealed venom, and today, the lid would be pried open. Present were the key figures: Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove, her face a mask of controlled emotion, her hands folded tightly in her lap; the vicar, Reverend Hargrove, his collar seeming to choke him as he shifted uneasily; Dr. Lionel Thorpe, his scholarly features drawn, his eyes darting with the wariness of a man cornered. And Mr. Percival Wren, the solicitor, clutching the Colonel's, were like a talisman. Margaret sat beside her aunt, her eyes wide with the gravity of the occasion, while Miss Clara Beale lingered at the door, her presence tolerated for her role as the village's unwitting chronicler. Inspector Harlan cleared his throat, his moustache bristling as he addressed the room. We've pieced together much, but gaps remain. 2 deaths, both from arsenic in Mrs. Hargrove's jam. Colonel Baxter at the gathering, Lydia Finch in her room. Motives abound, land disputes, blackmail, affairs, embezzlement. Today, we lay it bare. His gaze swept the group, lingering on. Each face. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic underscore to the silence. She had observed them, all the glances, the hesitations, the unspoken alliances, and her mind, honed by years in St. Mary Mead, had woven the threads into a coherent pattern. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice mild but commanding attention. All eyes turned to her, a frail, elderly lady who seemed to hold the room's fate in her gnarled hands. "The plum jam killed twice," she began, her tone conversational, as if discussing a recipe, but with a cunning twist that reveals the depths of human frailty. "Let us start with Colonel Baxter, a man of bluster with secrets, an affair in Netherby with Mrs. Hargrove's own sister, rekindled after years. Letters confirm it, hidden in Lydia's room. Mrs. Hargrove, you knew, didn't you? Your youthful indiscretion," Lydia hinted at it, "was tied to your sister's betrayal, a family wound festering." Mrs. Hargrove's composure faltered, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes," she whispered, "my sister confessed in a letter. The Colonel had promised to end it, but he lied. I confronted him at the fete, but I didn't. I couldn't." Her voice broke, and the vicar reached for her hand, his own trembling. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Rage, Mrs. Hargrove, can drive even the gentlest soul to dark acts. You poisoned the first batch subtly, with arsenic from your garden. Remedies fox, glove, monkshood, diluted to mimic natural contamination from the old mine's soil. You labeled it fate special, intending it for the Colonel, who always claimed the best jar. But fate twisted. He took it at the gathering, collapsing. Before all..." The room gasped, Harlan's eyes widening. "Mrs. Hargrove, but the jar tested clean afterward." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Because you swapped it later, didn't you? To cover your tracks, replacing the poisoned one with a safe twin from the pantry." Mrs. Hargrove slumped, nodding. "I couldn't let them find it. But Lydia, she saw me, or suspected. She was always watching, with her herbs and her knowing eyes." Miss Marple continued, her needles pausing. "Lydia Finch, the herbalist, harbored her own grievances. Colonel Baxter threatened to expose her remedies as fraudulent, potentially ruining her. She discovered your poison, Mrs. Hargrove, perhaps by tasting a trace or noticing your agitation. But instead of accusing, she plotted to use it blackmailing Dr. Thorpe over his embezzlement from the clinic funds he needed for the land he coveted." Dr. Thorpe started, his face paling. "She demanded money, threatening to reveal my borrowing. I diluted the remaining jam to frighten her, swapping jars again, hoping she'd think it contaminated and back off. I never meant to kill her, just a warning." The vicar's voice rose, strained. "But Lydia's death, it was no accident. She sampled it, yes, but the dose..." He trailed off, his eyes haunted. Miss Marple's gaze turned to him, compassionate yet unrelenting. "Ah, Vicar, Your role, the ultimate twist. You overheard confessions, your wife's rage, Lydia's blackmail, Thorpe's tampering. To protect Eleanor, you added a touch more arsenic from the rat poison you'd buried, thinking to frame Lydia as the poisoner, making her death seem self-inflicted in guilt. But you unwittingly amplified the diluted dose, causing her demise. Motives intertwined like the sticky threads of jam, jealousy, fear, greed, all fermenting in the sweetest places. The room fell silent, the truths laid bare, Harlan, marveling at Miss Marple's insight, moved to arrest Mrs. Hargrove for the Colonel's murder, the vicar for Lydia's, and Thorpe for his part in the tampering. Manslaughter for you, Doctor, but the chain of events. He shook his head, cuffs clicking. Mrs. Hargrove rose, defiant in defeat. I did it for my family, my sister's honor, but Lydia, that was never my intent. The vicar clung to her, whispering prayers, while Thorpe sat stunned. The weight of fate crushing him, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her expression serene. Human nature, Inspector, is predictable in its unpredictability. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen such tangles. Here, the jam unraveled them all. As the suspects were led away, the village exhaled, whispers turning to legend. Margaret, awed, turned to her aunt. You saw it all, Aunt Jane. How? Miss Marple smiled. By looking, my dear, and listening to the silence between words. The unmasking complete, Elmwood began to heal, but the shadow of the plum jam lingered, a reminder of darkness beneath domestic bliss. Chapter 14. Resolution. In the orchard the sun dipped low over Elmwood, painting the plum orchard in hues of amber and gold, as if nature itself sought to soften the harsh edges of human folly. Miss Jane Marple wandered among the trees, her steps measured, her black handbag swinging gently at her side. The air was sweet with the scent of ripening fruit, a poignant reminder of the jam that had wrought such devastation. Behind her, the vicarage stood silent, its windows shuttered against the village's prying eyes, while Inspector Harlan oversaw the final formalities, the arrests of Mrs. Eleanor Hargrove for the murder of Colonel Reginald Baxter, and her husband, the Reverend Hargrove, for the unintended slaying of Lydia Finch. Dr. Lionel Thorpe, though complicit in tampering, faced lesser charges of obstruction, his embezzlement laid bare, but his hands free of direct blood. Harlan approached Miss Marple, his hat in hand, his expression a blend of admiration and bewilderment. Miss Marple, I must say, your insight has been invaluable. Without you, we might have chased shadows forever. But how did you see through it, all the swaps, the dilutions, the hidden motives? His voice carried the respect of a man who had underestimated the quiet power of observation. Miss Marple paused by a laden branch, her fingers brushing a plum's velvety skin. Evil ferments in the sweetest places, Inspector, she replied, her voice soft yet resonant. Like this fruit, so inviting on the outside, but capable of turning sour if not handled with care. Mrs. Hargrove's rage over her sister's betrayal simmered for years, bubbling over when the Colonel's affair resurfaced. She laced the jam with arsenic from her garden poisons, intending a subtle end. But the Colonel's greed for the fete special sealed his fate. Harlan nodded, recalling the confessions, and Lydia Finch, discovering the tainted jar, saw an opportunity to blackmail Dr. Thorpe over his financial misdeeds. She swapped it back, planning to use the poison as leverage, but Thorpe, desperate, diluted it to warn her off. Precisely, Miss Marple continued, her eyes scanning the orchard as if reading secrets in the leaves. But the vicar, overhearing his wife's anguish and Lydia's scheming, added his own touch from the rat poison, thinking to make Lydia's death appear as suicide, framing her for both crimes to shield Eleanor. A twist of misguided love, turning dilution into lethality. Human nature, Inspector, is a garden of tangled vines, jealousy, fear, loyalty, all entwined. The inspector rubbed his chin, marveling, and the forged letter, the scratched lid, they were red herrings, planted by Lydia to deflect suspicion if her blackmail failed. Netherby's shadow, the land dispute, even the wills, codicil or distractions from the core, a family's fractured honor. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her gaze distant. Distractions, yes, but each revealed a truth. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen how small villages harbor great passions. Here, one jar unraveled so many lives, exposing the darkness beneath domestic bliss. As they walked back toward the vicarage, villagers gathered at the gate, their faces a mosaic of shock and relief. Miss Clara Beale whispered to a neighbor, her words carrying on the breeze. Who'd have thought the vicar's wife, driven by sisterly wrath, and the good reverend, his hands stained by protection. The postmistress's tales would grow into legend, the case of the plum jam that killed twice, a cautionary fable for Elmwood. Margaret met her aunt at the cottage, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Aunt Jane, it's over. But how tragic Mrs. Hargrove, so proud of her preserves, undone by them. And the vicar, his faith tested by his own deeds. Miss Marple patted her niece's arm, settling into her chair by the fire. Tragic, yes, but illuminating. People are like orchards, my dear, nurtured by sun and rain, but vulnerable to blight. The Hargroves' love twisted into crime, Thorpe's ambition into deceit, Lydia's cunning into her downfall. Yet the village will heal, whispers fading like autumn leaves. As evening fell, Miss Marple boarded the train back to St. Mary Mead. Her knitting resumed, the rhythmic click of needles a counterpoint to the clatter of wheels. She pondered the case, how one simple jar had exposed a web of secrets, an affair's lingering pain, a doctor's desperation, a lodger's opportunism, a husband's fatal loyalty. In her quiet cottage, she would resume her routines. But Elmwood's lesson lingered, testament to the perils lurking in the everyday, where sweetness could conceal the deadliest brew. The legend of the plum jam endured in Elmwood, a whisper, in gardens and tea rooms, reminding all that beneath the veneer of rural peace, the human heart beat with unpredictable rhythms,